Our first witness is David Jones, who's Professor in Bioethics at Mary's Twickenham and Director of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre at Oxford. I think, Professor Jones, you'd probably argue that the good science has done doesn't massively outweigh the bad. But in a couple of sentences, what sorts of research would you like to put the brakes on?
So first of all, I'd like to say science with a capital S is a kind of invention of the 19th century, and we should be very wary of ever people using the word. The natural sciences are good at creating knowledge. Knowledge is itself a good thing. Ethics comes in two places. First, how we create that knowledge, which we can do well or badly, and people in the past has done sometimes very well and sometimes very badly, and how we apply that knowledge, which can be done well and badly. And
Thank you. What do you want to put the brakes on?
First of all, things which we know are wrong, inherently wrong. Clearly lethal experimentation on people without their consent, which doesn't happen here, but does happen in some parts of the world. And we also use the knowledge that's been in the past from these things. But also, there are some things which there's a prima facie reason for thinking that we should ban them, unless and until very specific reasons have been shown that we shouldn't. Not, it might come in useful, I've got something like that in the garage. We need a good reason to overcome strong objections.
OK, Sarkar.
I want to talk a bit about the embryo research, which has just been reported in recent weeks. As I understand it, research using human embryos and stem cells is pretty tightly regulated. So you can't develop an embryo beyond 14 days. You have to have good reasons for conducting the research. What's your beef? What's the problem? What do you want to stop?
Well, I'll start with sort of questioning the premise. Last time I looked, and it was a while ago that I looked, perhaps even more than 10 years, but certainly well into the history of the HFEA, they had never refused a research license. And when asked about never refusing a research license, they said, oh, it's not because they're bad applications, but we work with them to make sure they're good. There's a very close, very uncomfortable relationship between the so-called regulator and the people who are doing these research. I don't have any trust in it. And also this particular piece of research, the synthetic embryos, hybrid embryos, if they're embryos, then some things which have been done are probably illegal.
So they're being called embryo models because they can't develop the way a human embryo would, so they say. But what's the problem with doing that kind of research? Is it because it raises the spectre of genetic engineering? What's the issue?
So lots of people don't particularly care about embryos, but people who do so because we used to be embryos, because that's the beginning of human life. So there are people who give a status to the embryo because of its place in the...
I understand that. I also used to be an ovum, I think, and then, I also menstruate every month.
So.
I mean,
But an ovum could be fertilised by millions and millions of sperm. It's not true that it used to be a ovum.
But not every embryo is viable. The point I'm making is your
not every
problem
person is viable.
Is your problem with embryo research that it skirts too close to interfering with human life, personhood? Is it because of genetic engineering? What's the issue?
I'm opposed to embryo research per se because I think it's unnecessary destruction of human life in its origins. But I also think that we've been over and over again sold a pig in a poke about what's supposed to be the good of these things. I was on these kind of shows back in 2007 where people were saying we had to create embryos which are a mixture of animal and human. And unless we did, then Alzheimer's and motor neurone disease and all these things were not going to get solved. Before the ink was dry on the law, before the law came into practice, it had all been that people had abandoned it because it was bogus in the first place.
Yes, because many experiments fail, right? That's the point of the scientific method, is that you try things, they fail, you try something else.
But you also have snake oil salesmen who sell things that don't have good evidence in the first place. And over again, they say things in the public which they wouldn't say in a grant application. They make promises about what they could do. They stir up anxiety and conflict in society about, if you get in the way of this, then you're getting in the way of progress. but they say things that they know are not well grounded in evidence.
Okay.
They're not actually well grounded in science.
But if we accept that the point of science and scientific experimentation is that things will fail and you'll learn from the failure and you'll try something again, and that's kind of how it goes. I mean, you're going to be funding a lot of failed research. We've all made that agreement with science.
Yes, but if you're going to so if I want to experiment on someone who can't consent, say, then there might be reasons that I might do so, but they would have to be much stronger reasons. Yes? If I want to experiment on chimps, then there would have to be strong reasons to do so. So sometimes you want to do things which are technically possible, but you want a strong reason. And there's a way outside chance that somewhere it might do some good is not a good enough reason. And the reasons which are given in public debate about these kind of issues are not of the level that they are in science.
Matthew Turner?
I think, and by the way, this is not an accusation, but I think you come at this partly from a kind of religious perspective. And how do we reconcile the spiritual with the scientific? Aren't they kind of inherently incompatible paradigms? As someone once said to me, if scientists could prove that God existed, religion would die because it's a matter of faith, not science.
I've got a degree from Cambridge and 3 degrees from Oxford, and they were both religious foundations, Oxford and Cambridge, as was Salamanca and Bologna, you know. And if you look at the writings of Newton and the writings of really the foundations of science and the scientific method don't come from people who are antagonistic to religion. The idea of a fundamental conflict of science and religion is an invention of the late 19th century and sort of post Wilberforce debate of
yeah, but I'm talking about now.
Now,
yes, and I'm asking how we would make compatible the kinds of issues, the kinds of criteria that matter from a theological perspective and the kinds of criteria that matter from a scientific perspective. How do you bring those worlds together?
So I think that fundamentally the religious interest, certainly the Christian interest, is in relation to the incarnation and it's in relation to humanity. So I think that Christians are more interested in trying to maintain humanity in contexts where various forces, both commercial and instrumental forces, might undermine humanity. And it's not only Christians who do this, but I think that's why they're motivated in this area. So I think there is a religious motivation, but the religious motivation is one which is a kind of humanism and which they would have in common with other people who are not religious.
But if we look at the history of religious interventions in science, from Copernicus to stem cells, they tend to be kind of prohibitions of knowledge. They're not. They're basically they are forms of thou shalt not do this or.
Here we go.
Or, no, but they're not principles based, are they?
You're not a historian then.
No, I'm saying that at certain times, religion has said this knowledge is not acceptable, or this area of inquiry is not acceptable, and so it's been about the prohibition of certain forms of knowledge and activity. I guess what I'm asking is what are the principles?
Who first conceived the Big Bang? Who put forward the Big Bang as the theory?
Well, Einstein. Yeah.
No.
Oh,
Lemaitre, a priest.
Okay, fine. Yeah,
a Belgian Catholic priest. It's simply
I'm not saying religious people. I'm not saying that religious people can't. I'm not saying that religious people can't be scientists or scientists can't be religious people. What I'm asking you is how it is. What would be the principles that you would want to put forward that would help us to guide science? And I'm saying that because the past has not so much been about principles as about prohibition. That's my point. So what are the principles?
I don't accept the premise, but I'll answer the question about the present. So what are the principles? The principles are about protecting people in relation to research. What counts as people? People might argue about. Also protecting animals, not as much as people, I'm afraid for some people out there, not as much as people, but non-human animals also need some kind of protection, so that they need justification for why you do things in relation to research. And with relation to applications, thinking in the longer term, but also democracy. We have a real problem with democracy in science. So constantly, the public are thought of as a threat to science, and we don't engage as much with the science. So I'm a member of a religious community, a Catholic community in this country, which is a minority. But I think that what needs to happen is that more people, more communities, more diverse communities need to be engaged in these debates and engaged in relation to science.
Professor Jones, thanks very much indeed.